Good morning, this is the Desert Shaman. I'm doing a follow-up on the supposed rally, as it was, the rally against the rage against the war. I got some thoughts on it. It ain't the 60s, baby. It ain't the 60s. Let's start at the beginning here. So I went to search for the rally at the Lincoln Memorial. And just searching for it, trying to find it on YouTube, was a major ordeal. I mean, nothing on YouTube. There was nothing on YouTube. And I searched time and time again. I finally came up with some guy that was an amateur, total amateur, doing a live stream of it. Problem was, the guy was a horrible cameraman. He was staring down at the ground all the time, showing people's feet, showing people from the neck down, and I'm like, what's with this? Not showing faces. Finally, he got into the situation where he was showing faces. And he got there early, and people were like scarce. Okay, they had everything set up. Wasn't too many people there. And I'm like, wow, really? So as it progressed on, it was a major ordeal just trying to listen to the speakers as this guy was walking around, staring down at the ground. And then when he finally did kind of wake up, he got all infatuated with certain personalities. Oh, there's so-and-so, or oh, there's this, and oh, there's that. Couldn't hear what the speakers were saying maybe 50% of the time. And as I'm watching, I'm looking out on the Lincoln Memorial, on the, the fountains there and the grass and everything, expecting to see thousands of people. Guess what? There was a few hundred people. A few hundred. It was pathetic. It was pathetic. Now, I have all kinds of ideas as to why this turned out the way it did. And here they are. Number one, there wasn't enough publicity. There wasn't enough publicity. And I assign the blame of that to, of course, the mainstream media isn't going to cover it. They're what they had going as far as, let's say, advanced advertising or advanced promotion, probably left a lot to be desired. I was disappointed, frankly. I mean, when I thought back to the 60s, now if you go back to the 60s and you think about, the famous protests at this very same place, like, let's say, with Martin Luther King and speakers like that, speakers with the moral imperative, real leaders. If you go back to that time, there were maybe 1 million people on the grounds there. I mean, I just have to shake my head. There were people singing in the 60s. There were people with signs. There were people that knew what was going on. There were people that were very passionate. There were people that were not only passionate, they were adamant. They were adamant. They were passionate. They knew what the score was back in the 60s. I wasn't there personally, but I did see it. It was televised. Now see, that's another thing. Back in the 60s, even though the government and the powers to be and all that were not down with the protests and the hippies and the movement, at least the media back then, oh, let's say people like Walter Cronkite and, yeah, I know I'm dating myself. That's okay. People like that there was coverage. There was coverage of all the events that happened back in the 60s. The protests in the street, Kent State, everything. You know, everything was covered. Everybody had an opinion. Now, it might not have been on the same page, but even the media and the television and all that started going more with the, let's say, psychedelic movement, hippie movement, anti-war movement. That was a special time in history. Was I expecting that same exact thing? Well, no, not exactly. But I was expecting more than what I saw. Now, here's another reason why I think that it was a failure. Because this was basically a politically motivated. You had different parties that were putting this on. You had the, oh, I forget what parties, libertarian parties. You had the libertarian parties. And there was another party that, to me, since I don't follow politics, was basically insignificant to me. Didn't matter what parties. Didn't really matter. I was hoping for the best. But see, this being orchestrated by the left and the right, it left a lot to be desired. There were people in there, younger people, that were there to make a name for themselves on some level, on some political level. There were people that were entrenched in politics previously and maybe had left the crowd. It was interesting. Okay, so you had people like Tulsi Gabbard and Ron Paul that came on later, and of course the crowd kind of increased a little bit, not all that much. It increased a little bit when those speakers there, but they had speakers like Chris Hedges, who was a war correspondent in Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan and all those major wars. He was on the front line. He was somebody that's seen the blood and gore, and kind of a leftist type guy, but not. It doesn't seem like he's that way anymore. He's basically realizing that there is no more real left like there used to be. There's also no more real right. So you had this splinter group of political parties that have never gotten anywhere, because that's not the way it's geared up. So you had people, now there were some good speakers that I happened to get a little bit of a drift of, like Gerald Celente, who was probably my age and seen the things that I've seen, and was back in the 60s. There was him, and he was probably one of the funniest and most, let's say, raw speakers. And then you had Jimmy Dore, the comedian. He was okay. And you had Tulsi Gabbard, who came on with her usual dialogue concerning how bad the other parties were and how irresponsible they were. So that's kind of the way it played out. You had Roger Waters, the guy, and he came there as on a video. Roger Waters was, I think, the head of Pink Floyd. Again, another person from that era. And he made some very cogent points, some very heartfelt points. But the problem with that is, okay, in order to consider himself valid, or in order to have people look at him, maybe even governmental people, I don't know, look at him as he's valid, he had to start off with the caveat that the war in, that the war in Russia, okay, or the war in Ukraine he made the statement inferring that, it was an illegal act by Putin, an illegal act. Now later on, after he had his little caveat there, he went into how, it was provoked by the West. The light's changing here, sorry. How it was provoked by the West. And he made some good points. But overall, okay, I mean, if you compare it, and I guess you can't compare it to the 60s because the 60s was a revolutionary time. The 60s was a time when we banded together, and it was almost like a last-ditch stand back then, because we were brought up, baby boomers were brought up under the heavy nuclear threat, but we realized it. We had a change of consciousness. We marched in the streets. Most of us were arrested over 20 times, even if it was just overnight. A lot of us got beat to a pulp, thrown in jail, just treated very badly, okay? Treated very badly. Assaulted by the police and whatever, arrested numerous times for trumped-up charges, stuff like that. Civil rights charges, whatever. But everybody back then got their ass out in the street, marched in the street in the thousands, went to gatherings like I described earlier about the Martin Luther King and, the big protests in Washington, on the Washington grounds back then. They were massive. They were massive. You had people singing, you had people playing guitars, you had people holding up peace signs, you had people, and I'm talking about 1 million people probably. Hard for me to remember, except that every inch of the ground was covered. Every inch of the ground, it was all people. It was like a blanket of people. Here, at this one, this rage against the war, I don't know, it just seemed too freaking commercial. It seemed too commercial, too contrived. And of course there was infighting as well. There was infighting behind the scenes as to whether they were going to allow people like Scott Ritter, former weapons inspector, and people like Colonel McGregor, and there was too much dissension. There was too much behind the scenes political maneuvering and game playing. See, we didn't have that back in the 60s. There were no games. There were no games. It was outright revolution. It was outright spiritual revolution. It was outright consciousness revolution. Psychedelics, change of consciousness, sense of urgency. Sense of urgency. Now, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis back then, and we realized that nuclear war was a threat back then. But see, now it's 10 times the threat. It's 100 times the threat, people. Because of the vicious powers to be that are controlling, the money people, the military-industrial complex. Same thing back then. It's all about money. It's all about making money. It's all about putting us on the brink for profit, for resources, for ideology. That's what it's about now. But I dare say that there's almost a lunatic fringe now. It's far more dangerous. So what does this tell you when 300-400 people show up? Probably that was it, 300 or 400 people, I'm guessing. Unless there's news today of otherwise, or I can find something today. Were there a bunch of cameramen and people and independent sources there recording the event? Well, yeah, they were all over the place and they were interviewing people. So maybe some of that stuff, that might be the silver lining here. Maybe some of that stuff will come out, be revealed, appear on different platforms or whatever, slowly seep into the consciousness of the people. But how pathetic that the American people, the brain-dead American people, the current generation of young people, don't have enough sense, can't pull their heads out of their ass and their iPhone long enough to realize the danger that they're in. They're in their own little world of like, oh boy, I got my iPhone, I got my computer, I got my, I'm free. Really? You're dead. You're dead. Or close to it. Wake the fuck up is all I have to say. Wake the fuck up. Get out and do what you're supposed to be doing. Maybe this will be a spark. Maybe this incident, this pathetic incident will be a spark, and maybe enough interviews and maybe films of it will spark something, I don't know. But it's not the same consciousness as back in the 60s. It's not, it's not, hey, we realize something is really wrong here and we got to do something about it. Our very existence on this planet depends on standing up to this, burning our draft cards, marching in the streets. Believe me, I was in that crew. I was at the forefront of it. I would be one of the first marchers going down the street. There was an awareness back then that things weren't right. Things were radically wrong. And we changed the course of history. Even the Native American spirit came in at that time and manifested itself in the consciousness of the peaceful hippies and the peaceful protesters and all the people back then. It even infiltrated onto TV, and we need a resurgence of that Native American consciousness, other consciousness, hippie consciousness, psychedelic consciousness, mind-altering consciousness. That's what we need now. We need a real sense of urgency. That if we don't. Also, you had the earth movement back then. People were very, very into earthy things, communes, sharing, making community meals, having gatherings, having love-ins. I can't tell you how many love-ins that I played at, being a musician back in that time, on the forefront of music at that time, in our area at least. I can't tell you how many love-ins I played. I can't tell you how many. There were more people at the love-ins than there were at this gathering. There were more people in Balboa Park in San Diego, or Presidio Park, or LA, or places in San Francisco. There were more people, twice as many more, 3 times as many more people just at a love-in. Fortunately, I experienced that. Fortunately, I was surrounded by love and peace and beautiful people dancing around in the parks and smoking joints and burning incense and giving each other flowers and basically having the taboo of sex went right out the window. It was just love, basically. Nobody thought about some kind of Christian ethic or morals as far as behaving yourself or anything like that. It was outside the box. It was beautiful. It was spontaneous. It was freedom. It was freedom. It was fun. In the midst of chaotic situations in our reality, it was fun. We had fun. We listened to music, but we were serious as well. We were serious. We put our butts on the line. I didn't see that. This ain't the 60s, baby. It's not the 60s. And where are all the young minds that are they on hold? What's happening? This is something that I consider a serious affair as far as, the future of the planet, the future of my grandchildren. Now, the grandchildren are probably smarter than the current generation. People of like 16 years old are probably the ones. But is there enough time? See, somebody dropped the ball here. Somebody dropped the ball. Somebody is dropping the ball. The consciousness that is out there is not a warrior consciousness. See, we were warriors in the 60s. We weren't just peaceniks, peace and love and all that stuff. There was a whole crew of us, okay, that considered ourselves warriors on a spiritual level. And sometimes it got to that point of violence, between the police and the protesters. Sometimes it got to that point. Hell, they killed kids at Kent State University, shot them down in cold blood. Are you kidding me? Look that one up if you're not aware of it. Kent State, okay? Look that up and see what they did, the National Guard did to the kids there. Look up the Democratic National Convention, I think it was, in Chicago. That was a bloodbath. People were warriors in the 60s. We got no warriors now. We got no spiritual warriors. We got no connection with Mother Earth and the whole thing that we had back then. Earth, baby. Earth. Earthy. Hippie. Go smoke a fucking joint if you have to. Drop some acid. Do it, take some mushrooms. What is it going to take to wake you up? Shamans did it. Back then, in a sense, we were all shamanistic. We were all shamanistic. We were into altering our consciousness. And we used many means to do that. We used mescaline, and we used mushrooms, and we used peyote, and we used LSD. And we always were given a vision. We were given a vision of what was really going on. We were seeing beyond the false reality, which was, even back then, was evident. I'm not saying that all the mainstream media was 100% on board. They were controlled back then, just not as much. So when you look at the stark fucking reality, what's going on now with the censorship, what's going on with the mainstream media, what's going on with the squelching. I mean, really, people, you're going to have an anti-war demonstration in Washington, and the mainstream media is not even going to say a peep about it? Really, people? And even the alternative media botches the job horribly. That's really one of the crux of the issues, is that the blanket of censorship and the blanket of oppression is so much more intense right now. There's nothing coming out. There's no debate allowed. This is like a country that is a tyrannical fascist, Pol Pot, or whatever, whoever you want to compare this to. It's worse than communism. It's worse than Marxism. Because it doesn't, the ideology is one more of ego, one more of control, which is always has, but it's intensifying. It's ramping up again. And you think the missile crisis in the 60s is bad, amplify that again 100 times, 200 times. Where you got nutcases talking about nuclear war every fucking day. Every day. People that are brain dead. The populace is brain dead. It's so squelched. It's so out of it. There is no room for a consciousness from a higher level consciousness to infiltrate its way through all the bullshit. It can't even get through the bullshit. People can't even be informed. You can consider this my speech, if I would have stood up, okay, back in the 60s or wherever, or at this rally. You can consider this my speech. Wake up, people. This is a pathetic showing, and the speakers at that rally should have said that. They should have said, wait a minute, this is it? This is all the people that's going to show up for this? You people need to talk to your friends. You people that have showed up here, I'm grateful, but you need to talk to your friends. You need to do more work. You need to do more warriorship on a spiritual level. You need to get people's ass off their chairs and get them moving. This is 100 times worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis. 100 times worse. The doomsday clock isn't at 5 to 12 anymore. It's at like 90 seconds. They just moved it. Do you want your grandchildren to have a happy life, or you just want them to be vaporized? That's pretty brutal, but that's the fact. Do you want your relatives and your grandchildren and the animals and all the things on Earth? Do you want them walking around in a fucking nuclear winter? You know what a nuclear winter is like? It's a slow death. and a gloomy death, and a heart-rending death, slow. Unless it stopped, okay? Unless it stopped. And let's reverse the course here. Let us reverse the course. This comes with consciousness. And I've talked about it so many times from my shamanistic level. Comes from consciousness, comes from operating from alternative realities. Just like we did in the 60s. Do you think I just made this shit up like in the last 60 days or something? Talking about alternative realities and having the power from that sense of consciousness. Okay? Having the power like an antenna. Okay, back then in the 60s, we all had antennas that were fully out and rotating and connecting with each other. Lucid thinking. People thought, okay? They weren't dumb. They were well-read, most of them. Got people like Leary, and you got people like Allen Ginsberg and Alan Watts and a whole crew of people that were reading all kinds of things about what the future brought. 1984, Huxley's Brave New World, all kinds of philosophical literature on what was happening in civilizations and how they could be corrupted to the max and how they could subjugate the people in a Orwellian or utopian, not utopian, dystopian world. We all knew about that stuff. And we all realized that we got to do something. We got to do something here. We got to get out in the streets. We got to congregate in the hundreds of thousands. We got to march in the streets. Where is that fucking spirit? If you're going to live in a false reality, just like Krishna told Arjuna, hey, do what you got to do. It's a dream anyway. It's a dream anyway, so act it out. Do what you got to do. Do what is required of you. So that's my recap on the big rally. You know, when I said I could be being misled too, back when I was telling you about this, I wasn't kidding. I mean, misled in the sense that I had more faith that more people were going to show up and it would be a landmark thing almost, or at least a thing that they would be real hard for them to cover up. But they probably will cover this up pretty easily, I'd say. They have already. So, yeah, that's my take. That's my take on it. Think about what I said, It's a whole different way of operating, modus operandi. It's a whole different way to go to that consciousness and do whatever needs to be done. Hell, if you got to get out in the streets and die, and make it fun like we did. Bear arms. Do whatever you got to do. Just don't sit around on your ass. This is the 60s thunder coming out here. Enjoy.